I'm afraid I'm being cast as the villain of this particular trio because I am going to be a little bit more pessimistic. But I'm going to start on a high note, which is the Roman Empire in 211 AD. So the glory that was Rome. In 211 AD, things had been going great for hundreds of years. This is a quite detailed map that shows the extent of the Roman Empire at 211. This is probably the greatest geographic extent. And the city of Rome itself was, of course, a legendarily glorious place. Anybody know what the population of the city of Rome was in 211 AD approximately? About 1 million to 1.5 million, depending on which estimates you believe. So, it's the biggest city in the world. It's thriving. It's been going very well. And there was, in fact, a huge culture industry to celebrate the quality of Rome. Actually, it was mostly based in Greece, a series of Greek orators. And I want to quote from one of them, a fellow named Aelius Aristides. And he spoke of the glory that was Rome. He said, "Were there ever so many cities, inland and maritime? Were they ever so well built? Could a person ever travel in such style, counting up the cities by the number of days on the road, sometimes passing several every day? Like a girdle around the waist of the world, likewise Rome's dominion stretched to the sea. Towards Rome the continents slope, supplying her with an endless flow of goods. From far and wide, land and sea, comes all that the seasons bring forth, all that is produced in every country. Not one thing raised or manufactured by any nation is not here, in surplus. With each new harvest, in each season, freighters come from around the world and arrive here so that the city is like an amalgamated warehouse of the world. The arrivals and departures never cease." I was reading this as I was watching the ships coming in and out of the Oakland harbor and having a similar kind of thought just the other day. The ships keep coming in from China. They're full of goods, and the empty boxes pile up, and it's going to last forever. Now, Aelius was not a completely a foolish person. He recognized that there were some things that weren't going so well. There was a lot of inequality, for example, in Rome. But he said, and I quote him again here, things are as they are satisfy both the poor and the rich. There is no other way of life that exists, after all. And of course, there were problems with the barbarians in the north and the Persians off to the east. And he explained how one has to deal with these things. And again, I quote him. He said, "You discipline them more or less gently. You've examined their tempers and you treat them accordingly. And in general, however, a manifest freedom from fear is given to all throughout the empire." So things were great, right? Now, of course, the crisis of the 3rd century, as it's known to historians, was just about to arrive. And over the next couple of hundred years, a whole series of calamities would ensue. This has been written about by Joseph Tainter in his excellent book on the collapse of civilizations, about how efforts to reinvent the institutions of the Roman Empire were done repeatedly over time in trying to create more complexity to support a greater and ever more complicated system. But we know how this went. 1,000 years after this, actually 800 years after this, you know what the population of the city of Rome is? Anybody know? 10,000. That's a more than 99% decline. Okay? So, now, this is history. What I'd like to do is suggest that we face similar kinds of headwinds today, institutionally. And we're actually, despite the things that Professor Pinker just showed us, for the last 50 years or so, we, particularly in the West, are experiencing a great deal of institutional decay in the kinds of institutions that are needed in order to perpetuate the kinds of advances which he quite rightly points out have been sustained over the last, particularly 50 years, but really the last several hundred years. And the reasons for those, for that, and I'd like to talk just briefly about a couple of the reasons for those declines. And they are, they might be labeled what I refer to as the Twin Insurgency. I believe that the institutions that support a complex and ever-progressing civilization are under assault, both from below and from above. Now, from below, we have what sometimes is called a criminal insurgency. All over the world, we see networked bad actors, narco-traffickers, human traffickers, hackers, who are systematically trying to undermine the foundations of our rule of law in order to enrich themselves in various ways. They see the differences in the legal infrastructures of different states as arbitrage opportunities that they can exploit to enrich themselves. These are often people who come from excluded backgrounds and don't think that the system that's becoming ever more unequal, as we know from Thomas Piketty, is one that affords them with licit paths to riches. And so systematically, there are people, criminals all over the world, who are attacking the institutions of the state, being parasitic on the institutions of the state in order to enrich themselves. But equally insidiously, we have another insurgency which is coming from above, and I refer to that as the plutocratic insurgency. This is the wealthy, who are also interested in undermining the institutions of the state, which they see as usurping their ability to enrich themselves through the processes of globalization. We see a whole variety of different organizations that are tax resistant, that are trying to attack the powers of the welfare state to engage in redistribution, to engage in programs that promote egalitarian outcomes of the sort that drive the improvements that Professor Pinker was talking about all along. Now, this brings us, so these two phenomena have been going on, as I say, with gathering strength for 40 or 50 years, and we can talk at length during the discussion about what the underlying structural reasons are for these two insurgencies, one from above and one from below. But what I'd like to do is just suggest that the get-out-of-jail-free card that people usually use when people talk about Rome and why Rome is not an example is that, well, we have something the Romans didn't, right? We have a basis for innovation and ever improvements. We have abilities to generate new solutions to problems and new ways of doing that that don't apply that the Romans did not have. However, what I would like to close with is the thought that this process, this cycle of innovation that we rely on and that we have faith in to generate ever more progress, itself is resting on a platform of state and state-driven institutions, particularly around education, higher education, and research. It's being fundamentally undermined by the decay of those kinds of institutional bases as a result of this twin insurgency. And the question is, are we going to be able to continue to generate the basic science and the innovation networks that are able to sustain improvements over time if we're fundamentally undermining the institutional bases of those kinds of changes? And I look forward to discussing that more with both Ruth and Stephen in a moment. Thank you.